7 minutes. Just 7 minutes for Jasmine Crockett, a courageous black attorney, to do what no one else dared. Handcuff a powerful white judge right in the courtroom he had manipulated for 23 years. This happened in front of the stunned faces of 12 jurors and dozens of reporters, in a trial that seemed rigged to silence justice. But what really happened behind that cloak of power? How did one young woman uncover a dirty scheme capable of shaking the entire judicial system to its core? The courtroom was vast, resembling an arena of power. The harsh light from the overhead lamps cast long shadows on the cold stone floor, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. Each of Jasmine Crockett's steps echoed sharply across the polished wooden floor, but the sound was not enough to break the oppressive silence that hung in the air. The room was still. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on her, like a net tightening around its prey. Jasmine entered, carrying a stack of thick legal files in her hand, her face resolute, her eyes bright with determination. It seemed as if all attention in the room had focused on her, the only black woman in a courtroom full of powerful, wealthy faces. Time itself seemed to pause, and the air crackled with an unspoken intensity. This was no ordinary trial for Jasmine. This was the one chance to uncover the truth about Robert Mitchell, a wealthy real estate developer accused of embezzling millions of taxpayer dollars. But this was also a much larger battle, the fight to prove that a young black woman could stand firm in a world rife with bias, where those in power often believed that her voice wasn't strong enough to be heard. She stood firmly at the prosecution table, her hands gripping the stack of files, her gaze unwavering. Everyone in the room, from the defendant's attorneys to the court officials, looked at her with skepticism. They didn't speak, but the contempt in their eyes was palpable. Then her gaze met the icy stare of Judge Edward Thornton. He was the man in charge of the courtroom, a judge known for his ruthlessness and bias in his rulings. His eyes were as cold as ice, sharp enough to make others feel judged at the first glance. Thornton appeared unfazed by her entry, but it was clear he couldn't ignore her presence. To him, a young black female attorney from a marginalized community was an unacceptable challenge. Jasmine didn't flinch. She walked to the prosecution table and set the stack of files down with absolute calm. A quiet sigh and murmurs rippled through the jurors, the defense attorneys, and even some of the audience. They didn't speak, but their eyes said it all. A young black woman could never stand up to a system that had so many layers of protection in place. But Jasmine paid no attention to their glares. She had grown too accustomed to prejudice, too accustomed to fighting in a society that wasn't kind to those like her. Every step she took wasn't just to defend a case. It was to defend all those left in the shadows of a broken justice system. The light from the lamp seemed to shine brighter as she stood there, not because of her radiance, but because she was a small light in a room darkened by bias and injustice. Jasmine wasn't the only one to notice this. The entire courtroom felt the shift. Though she was just a young attorney, Jasmine was bringing a fresh wind, a fight for truth and justice that had long been buried. Those present in the courtroom began to feel her presence, not just as a representative for the case, but as a symbol of change, a change they could no longer ignore. Jasmine Crockett stood there, unwavering and strong, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she knew only courage could defeat the forces trying to suppress the truth. She wasn't just representing a case. She was representing those whose voices had been silenced in a world filled with injustice, and she would not back down. The courtroom once again plunged into a deep silence, broken only by the sharp click of Judge Thornton's gavel striking the wooden bench. This time, every eye in the room was glued to him, but his gaze remained locked on just one person, Jasmine Crockett. Perched high above the others in his judicial chair, Judge Thornton's expression was like a frozen slab of stone, impervious to all but his own sense of power. He surveyed Jasmine with a look that seemed to slice through the air, as if appraising prey. His back straight, hands resting crossed on the desk before him. Every movement of his was calculated, deliberate, and carried an aura of authority that could not be denied. He raised his gavel, bringing it down hard once again, a reminder to everyone that he was the one in control here. It was a signal, a forceful declaration that he would not allow anything to challenge his dominance in this room. "We are not playing a media game, young lady." Thornton's voice sliced through the air, cold as ice. each word echoing in the courtroom like a precise weapon. "This is a courtroom, and I suggest you act like it." His words were not just a mild reprimand, but a blatant declaration of disdain, a calculated attempt to put Jasmine in her place. It was as if he saw her presence as nothing more than an annoyance, a distraction that needed to be swiftly dealt with. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for her to respond, for her to cower under the weight of his words. But Jasmine wasn't one to shrink in the face of intimidation. Thornton's statement wasn't just a simple attempt to rein in her behavior. It was an attack, a direct challenge to her, meant to strip her of her credibility. His voice, sharp and unforgiving, was loaded with an unmistakable message: "You are not welcome here. You do not belong." His words made it clear that, to him, she was just another young black woman unworthy of being in a space so dominated by power, privilege, and wealth. Every word he uttered was soaked in contempt, as if he had already decided she was beneath him, her struggle meaningless in the face of his authority. Jasmine felt the weight of his words press down on her, but she refused to be crushed. The look in Thornton's eyes, the cruel, dismissive gaze, only served to fuel her fire. He may have believed his words were a reminder to keep her in line, but to Jasmine, they were nothing more than an invitation to prove him wrong. As the tension in the room thickened, Jasmine's heart began to steady. She could feel the pressure mounting, the stares of doubt and skepticism coming from every corner of the room. She could sense the ridicule in the air, could almost hear the whispers of the jurors and the defense attorneys who questioned whether someone like her, someone so young, so unproven, so black, could possibly stand up to the might of a judge as formidable as Thornton. But instead of flinching, instead of recoiling, Jasmine stood even taller, her eyes locking with Thornton's, never wavering. She took a deep breath, steadying herself in the face of the storm. She wasn't just going to fight for the case before her. She was fighting for something far bigger than that. She was fighting for every voice that had ever been silenced, every injustice that had been swept under the rug. This moment wasn't just about a legal battle. It was about confronting a system that had long been rigged in favor of those like Thornton, and Jasmine wasn't about to let it stand without challenge. With calm but unwavering conviction, Jasmine spoke. "I only want the truth to come to light," she said, her voice clear and firm. The words cut through the tension in the room, sharp and resolute. There was no hesitation in her tone, no doubt in her mind. Her response wasn't just a simple rebuttal to Thornton's insult. It was a declaration, a proclamation of everything she stood for, everything she was fighting for. Her voice resonated through the room, every syllable challenging Thornton's attempt to belittle her. The effect of her words was immediate. The jurors began to shift in their seats, murmuring quietly among themselves, casting furtive glances at one another. Some looked at Jasmine with suspicion, their faces etched with doubt, unsure if she had the strength to stand up to the system. Others glanced nervously at Thornton, sensing the shift in the room, the tension building like an impending storm. The defense attorney, a man in his 50s dressed in a sharp gray suit, smirked as if he found the whole situation laughable. He gave Jasmine a look of condescension, his gaze dismissive, as if to say, "You're out of your depth." He looked at her like she was a mere child attempting to play in a world that was too big for her, a world where people like him and Thornton held all the power. But Jasmine stood her ground. She could feel the weight of their judgments, their disbelief, but none of it moved her. Instead, the whispers, the looks, the doubts only made her more determined. She wasn't here to win their approval. She wasn't here to play by their rules. She was here to expose the truth, and she wouldn't stop until she did. Thornton, despite his cold exterior, was visibly unsettled. Jasmine's defiance was unexpected, and it made him uncomfortable. He had assumed that a woman like her, young, black, and from a background so different from his own, wouldn't dare challenge him in such a high-stakes case. The cold, detached facade he wore now cracked ever so slightly, and for the briefest moment, a flicker of uncertainty passed through his eyes. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her. This wasn't just another routine trial. It was something much more. It was a battle between the entrenched power he represented and the truth that Jasmine now wielded in her hands. Thornton cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure, but his words were no longer as sure as before. "Really?" he exhaled, the attempt to maintain his authoritative tone faltering. "You must understand that in this room, we do not have room for public spectacles. I expect you to present your evidence clearly and not drag this out." His voice was no longer as icy and commanding as before. Now there was an edge of urgency creeping in. He needed to rein her in, to stop her from gaining any more ground. But Jasmine could hear the hint of desperation in his words. The confidence that had once defined him was slowly slipping away. Jasmine was unshaken. She carefully gathered the stack of files in front of her, organizing the papers with deliberate precision. Each page she turned was met with an almost musical rustle, as if to underscore her focus. Every eye in the room was on her now, the tension so thick it was nearly tangible. The jurors, the defense team, and even the spectators all seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next move. Another beat of silence passed, stretching the atmosphere so tight it felt like it might snap. Thornton, trying to regain control, slammed his gavel down again, its echo reverberating throughout the room. But Jasmine's gaze never wavered. She stared at him, unflinching, as if daring him to try to intimidate her again. And then, in that silence, something shifted. Jasmine knew that this was her moment, not just to fight for justice, but to expose the corruption, the lies, and the injustice that had been hidden for so long. The system Thornton represented had worked hard to bury the truth, to silence the voices that dared to challenge it. But Jasmine wasn't going to let that stand. She was here to reveal it all, every dark secret, every lie, every manipulated truth. She wasn't just going to fight for the people who had been wronged. She was fighting for herself, for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong in a room like this. And she wouldn't back down, not today, not ever. The courtroom was as silent as an abandoned house, every gaze still fixed on Jasmine. The tension in the air was thick, almost tangible, as though you could cut it with a knife. Jasmine slowly raised her hand, carefully grasping the thick stack of documents on the table. She opened it, pausing for a moment, scanning the room before she began to speak. Every motion she made was being watched, as if she were about to step into a battle that could change everything. Never before had she felt such profound stillness in a courtroom. Every sound, even the smallest movement, seemed to be amplified tenfold. She glanced over at the jurors, then her gaze lingered on Judge Thornton. His cold, unwavering eyes followed every movement she made, but Jasmine remained unshaken. She knew this was the pivotal moment. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, and your honor." Her voice rang out clearly, cutting through the quiet. "I stand here today to present a case where the truth has been buried beneath a pile of forged documents, shady contracts, and a system of power that has turned a blind eye to the embezzlement of public funds by Robert Mitchell." Jasmine gently flipped through the pages of her file, revealing irrefutable evidence. Each document was a piece of the larger puzzle she was slowly putting together before the jury. Here are bank statements showing a transfer of public funds from the city's treasury into Robert Mitchell's personal account. The amount totals millions of dollars. One of the jurors sitting at the head of the table leaned forward, his eyes fixated on the documents Jasmine presented. The entire room remained silent. Every figure, every transfer, every signature was being laid out in meticulous detail. Jasmine's voice grew more determined as she continued. Mitchell used his position to carry out illegal transactions, funneling money from the city's budget into personal accounts, blatantly violating financial regulations set by the city. The jurors exchanged looks. Some began scribbling notes, their eyes beginning to shift. A few nodded as if they were starting to grasp the gravity of what Jasmine was presenting. But in the midst of this, Judge Thornton suddenly interrupted, his voice booming like a warning. "Miss Crockett, let me remind you that this is not a laboratory. The evidence you're presenting must be far more credible than just bank statements and unverified documents. We need a detailed explanation of the origin of these documents." Thornton's voice remained cold as ever, his gaze still as unyielding as before, showing no sign of wavering. Jasmine wasn't caught off guard by his rebuttal. She had expected this. She knew Thornton wouldn't simply accept the evidence she was presenting without challenge. But because of that, she had to be even more resolute. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself, feeling the weight of every eye in the room shift toward her. "Your Honor, all of these documents have been verified by the Department of Justice, and I can provide the original documents if necessary, Jasmine replied, her voice calm but filled with undeniable strength. She didn't need to prove anything beyond the truth these documents represented. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Thornton, who had been sitting tall and composed, shifted slightly in his seat. His face no longer carried the unshakable confidence it once had. Despite his reluctance to admit it, he knew that what Jasmine had said was valid. The jurors were now paying closer attention, some exchanging looks as if they were reconsidering everything they had previously known. We reserve the right to independently verify these documents. Thornton's voice was no longer as forceful as before. If you cannot provide further specific evidence, I will have to reconsider the entire process of this trial. Jasmine smiled faintly. Of course, Your Honor. I am fully prepared to request an independent audit if necessary. We cannot allow the truth to be concealed. Jasmine's words were not just a statement of faith in the truth. They were a bold challenge to Thornton and the system he represented. For a brief moment, the entire courtroom fell into silence again. Everyone in the room understood that this confrontation was no longer just about one case. It was about the hidden forces at play, the powerful undercurrents that had been manipulating everything from behind the scenes. The courtroom was stifled in a tense silence. Every person present had their eyes fixed on Jasmine Crockett, but not with admiration or encouragement, only with suspicion and skepticism. There were glares of discomfort, sneers of disdain, as though she didn't belong there, as if she were an imposter in a space that was reserved for the powerful, the privileged, and the entrenched system. But Jasmine remained unshaken, her resolve unbroken. Not a flicker of hesitation crossed her face. Every step she took, every word she spoke, was a quiet but powerful defiance. She was determined to stand tall, no matter the scorn thrown her way. She wasn't here to appease anyone, nor was she here to apologize for her presence. This was about one thing, truth, and she would not allow the weight of contempt or the chains of discrimination to silence it. Under the unyielding, cold gaze of Judge Thornton, Jasmine continued her meticulous presentation of evidence. She wasn't in a hurry. She turned each page of her documents deliberately, as though each page held a new key to unlock the doors of truth. Each page was a new leaf in the wind of justice. And yet, Thornton was relentless. He wasn't going to let her speak without interruption, without trying to bend the truth she was presenting. Every time she opened her mouth to speak, he was there, cutting her off, attempting to control the narrative before she could get too far. Your Honor, Jasmine began once more, her voice strong, steady, and yet calm. This is a copy of a transaction transfer from the city's public funds into Robert Mitchell's personal account. Not only is the amount large, but it has been divided into multiple installments, each showing signs of money laundering. She slowly and deliberately turned the page of her document, raising it high enough for everyone to see. Every number, every signature, every line of text was visible. It was laid out in stark, undeniable detail, proof of Mitchell's illegal actions, proof that he had been siphoning public money for personal gain. A juror sitting at the head of the table leaned forward, their eyes glued to the document Jasmine was presenting. The entire courtroom fell into a quiet, heavy stillness. It was as though the very air around them thickened with the gravity of what Jasmine was revealing. Her words were not just facts. They were the threads of a larger story, a story that had been hidden, suppressed, and buried under layers of corruption and deceit. Jasmine's words were the truth exposed to light for the first time, and they were cutting through the fog of lies that had been spun around Mitchell's actions. However, just as the truth began to sink in, Thornton's gavel slammed down sharply, cutting through the silence. Miss Crockett, he interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. What exactly are you proving here? We're not here to look at meaningless pieces of paper. I demand that you clarify everything, provide authentic evidence, and no vague insinuations. Jasmine wasn't caught off guard. She'd anticipated his dismissal. She'd known from the start that Thornton wasn't going to easily accept the evidence she was presenting. He wasn't here to seek the truth. He was here to maintain the status quo, to protect the system he'd spent years propping up. But Jasmine wasn't going to let him dictate her actions. With a quiet, deep breath, she stood firm, her eyes locking onto Thornton's. His contempt was nothing new to her. It was something she had faced her entire life, and she wasn't about to let it deter her now. She met his gaze head-on, her voice unwavering as she replied, "Your Honor, I am not here to entertain unnecessary demands. I am here to present the truth. I am not here to please anyone but the people who deserve justice, the people who have been silenced for far too long." The weight of her words hung in the air, every syllable measured, precise, and brimming with a quiet defiance that only grew stronger with each passing second. On the other side, Mitchell's lawyers seized the opportunity to undermine her. "She's just speculating," one of Mitchell's attorneys blurted, a derisive laugh escaping his lips. "There's no evidence here that proves this money is illegal. Miss Crockett can't just throw numbers at us and claim they're related to crime." His words echoed through the room, a snide sneer directed at Jasmine's efforts to expose the truth. But Jasmine remained unshaken. She smiled faintly, a subtle but powerful gesture that showed she wasn't rattled by their dismissive remarks. She wasn't here to prove herself to them, nor was she here to win their approval. She was here for something much bigger than that. She turned back to Thornton, holding his gaze, unwavering, challenging him without a hint of anger. "Your Honor, I am not speculating. I am presenting evidence that I have gathered. All of it is legally sourced, and it can and will be verified. But if you insist on an independent investigation, I am more than prepared to request that immediately. I will not let this truth be buried under more lies." Thornton's expression faltered slightly. He paused, exhaling sharply, his eyes narrowing as if considering his next words very carefully. There was a flicker of uncertainty beneath the icy exterior he had carefully crafted over the years. Thornton knew that his usual methods of intimidation and control wouldn't be enough to shut down this young woman. He knew that Jasmine's resolve was unyielding, that she wouldn't be silenced by his threats or scorn. But what concerned him more than anything was the growing sense that his authority, the very authority he had spent so long building, was beginning to crack. The atmosphere in the courtroom thickened, the tension palpable. The jurors exchanged looks, some leaning in to catch every word, their expressions shifting ever so slightly. There was a subtle change in how they viewed Jasmine. A few of them nodded, a silent acknowledgement that they were beginning to feel the righteousness in her argument. But others remained unmoved, their skepticism still intact, unwilling to let go of the biases they had carried into this room. Thornton cleared his throat and sat back in his chair. He struck the gavel again, though this time it was softer, less commanding. "Miss Crockett, I do not wish to waste any more time on these trivial matters," he said. But his voice now held a trace of hesitation, a slight falter. "I demand that you provide clearer, more conclusive evidence, and only with that will I allow this trial to proceed." Jasmine didn't react to his challenge. She didn't need to. All she needed to do now was wait. She knew this wasn't just a legal battle, it was a psychological one. Thornton was testing her resolve, pushing her to see if she would bend under the weight of his contempt. But Jasmine had faced worse. She had faced the deep-rooted bias of a society that didn't want to hear the voices of people like her. She had faced the systemic prejudice of a system that was designed to suppress the truth, and she had always stood strong. "Your Honor," Jasmine continued, her voice steady and unwavering, "I will continue presenting further evidence to demonstrate the corruption of Mr. Mitchell and those who are involved in this case. I am willing to wait as long as it takes for the truth to be recognized. I will not stop until it is." In that moment, Jasmine wasn't just standing up for the people who had been wronged. She was standing up for herself, for the people who had been overlooked, forgotten, and silenced. And she was ready to fight for them, no matter the cost. Jasmine paused on a particular page, her sharp eyes scanning every word. It was a contract between Robert Mitchell and a company that immediately struck her as suspicious. She quickly skimmed over it again, but this time her heart skipped a beat as she noticed an important detail she had overlooked earlier. "This transfer," Jasmine whispered, her eyes locking on a small note in the corner of the contract, $3 million into the account of a company that doesn't even exist. She held up the document, revealing the massive sums being transferred to a so-called company with no legitimate trace. The amounts weren't just illogical. They were being funneled into a ghost company. No name, no official registration, nothing to indicate that it was a legal entity. It was a perfect scheme, and Jasmine could feel a growing frustration as she realized just how deep Mitchell's deception had gone. She pressed on, carefully examining every page, every number, as the pieces slowly started to form a larger picture. Mitchell had falsified transactions, created shell companies, and laundered millions of dollars from public funds. These details were undeniable. Jasmine felt the tension building in her chest, but she refused to let her emotions cloud her actions. She knew this was the decisive evidence she had been searching for. Looking up, she placed the document down on the table slowly. The room seemed to hold its breath. Every eye in the courtroom focused on her. The air grew heavier, the tension almost palpable. The jurors leaned in, hanging on every word, while the rest of the room remained dead silent, awaiting the next move. She turned a few more pages, revealing that the money had been transferred through an anonymous account system. No trails left, no trace of legality, only fraudulent documents to cover the tracks. In a calm yet powerful voice, Jasmine spoke. "Your Honor, this is clear evidence. $3 million were transferred into a company that doesn't exist, a company without a business license, without any legal documentation. This is the unmistakable trail of public fund embezzlement." The words hit the room like a jolt of electricity, and the atmosphere became even more suffocating. Jasmine continued to open more documents, each page a stone in the wall of truth she was diligently building. But almost immediately, Thornton struck his gavel sharply, cutting off the rising tension. His cold eyes locked on Jasmine, his face twisting into an expression of annoyance. "Miss Crockett," Thornton's voice was flat but tinged with irritation. "You're presenting these documents without any legitimate verification of their origin. These documents aren't solid enough to support such a serious accusation." Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood tall, her eyes meeting Thornton's with unwavering resolve. She was prepared for his denial and manipulation. "Your Honor, these documents have been verified by the Department of Justice. They are legally obtained and fully authenticated. If necessary, I am more than willing to request an independent investigation to clarify the matter." The jurors exchanged glances, some starting to make notes, their expressions shifting as if they were beginning to see the seriousness of what Jasmine was presenting. However, Mitchell's attorney was relentless in his rebuttal. "We can't accept these documents based on a small piece of evidence presented by Ms. Crockett. These are assumptions, not verified facts." Jasmine paid no mind to the objections. She had heard countless such baseless arguments from those who had spent years keeping silent in the face of powerful manipulation. But this time, she would not let the truth be buried. "Your Honor," Jasmine said, her voice unwavering, "justice is not a game for the powerful. Justice is about real evidence, and that is exactly what I am presenting. If these pieces of evidence are not strong enough, I am prepared to bring forth more." Jasmine took a step forward toward Thornton. The room seemed to stop breathing, the tension so thick no one dared to move or make a sound. Every eye in the room was fixed on Jasmine, and her gaze never wavered from Thornton's sharp, cold eyes. She knew this was the moment that everything would change. She would not let manipulation continue. The truth would not be concealed any longer. The courtroom had now become a battlefield, a fierce clash between truth and power. Despite Jasmine presenting clear and irrefutable evidence, the resistance from Judge Thornton was suffocating the air, making every moment feel like a struggle for breath. Every time Jasmine unveiled a new piece of evidence, every time she took another step toward exposing Robert Mitchell's fraud, Thornton immediately interrupted with irrelevant questions, trying to derail the investigation she was painstakingly constructing. It wasn't just the facts of the case that she had to battle. It was the very justice system itself that was seemingly trying to suppress the truth. "Miss Crockett," Thornton's voice cut through the room, his cold gaze never leaving Jasmine. "I cannot accept these accusations without clear proof. Everything you say must be thoroughly verified. You cannot simply stand here and defend a viewpoint without sound evidence." Jasmine could feel the threat in his words. Every question he posed wasn't just a challenge. It was an attempt to obscure all the evidence she had painstakingly presented. Thornton knew full well that if he could sow doubt, if he could make her waver, he would regain control over the courtroom and, by extension, over the case. But Jasmine didn't let Thornton's interruptions shake her resolve. She stood tall, unflinching, her sharp eyes locked on his. She was ready to face his denials and manipulation head-on. "Your Honor, I am presenting legitimate, legally obtained evidence. These documents have been thoroughly verified and are ready to be confirmed through the appropriate channels. But I will not accept that we stop here based on baseless doubts. Though Jasmine spoke with unwavering conviction, Thornton continued to manipulate the situation, persistently asking irrelevant questions, trying to distract from the case at hand. So, can you explain why these funds have no clear origin in Mitchell's financial statements? He pressed. These numbers could simply be a misunderstanding during the auditing process. Do you have any proof that all of these documents are legal? He was deliberately cornering Jasmine, forcing her to explain every single detail unnecessarily. Jasmine could feel the manipulation in every question Thornton asked. It wasn't about seeking the truth. It was a tactic to erode her confidence, to waste time and distract from the case she was building. Meanwhile, Mitchell's attorneys were also actively opposing her, stepping up their resistance with every passing moment. Your Honor, all of Mr. Mitchell's transactions follow proper legal procedures. These documents could simply be part of a routine financial procedure, nothing abnormal here. Ms. Crockett cannot just stand up and say this is criminal activity without thorough verification, one of Mitchell's lawyers said, his face adorned with a smug smile, as if he already knew there would be pushback from Jasmine. Behind them, the jurors began whispering among themselves. Some were silently taking notes, while others exchanged skeptical glances, struggling to stay focused amidst the irrelevant questions Thornton kept throwing at them. The pressure from the defense and from Thornton himself was making the atmosphere even more charged, distracting from the truth Jasmine was desperately trying to expose. Jasmine noticed the manipulation happening around her, but she wasn't afraid. She knew this was the moment to assert her resilience. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady. I am not speaking based on assumptions. I have presented a series of documents, including financial transactions and contracts, to prove Mitchell's embezzlement. These documents are not forged, and I am ready to request an independent investigation if needed. Her eyes remained locked on Thornton's, and she could feel the tension in the room rising. But it was her calm demeanor that made everything seem even clearer. Thornton's questions weren't about finding the truth. They were a strategy to force her into a corner. But Jasmine had been preparing for this moment. Each time he struck his gavel, each time he asked an irrelevant question, it only made her more determined. Miss Crockett, Thornton said, his tone heavier now, as though he was trying to mask the uncertainty within him. We cannot continue this trial if you cannot prove these accusations with absolute clarity and authenticity. Jasmine smiled faintly. Your Honor, I have already proven everything I can. If you do not trust this evidence, I will request an independent investigation, and I hope that the truth will not be concealed. The courtroom was now at a boiling point. Jasmine knew that only perseverance and courage could get her closer to justice. But the question remained. Would Thornton and the forces behind him allow her to reach it? That question still hung in the air, leaving everyone in suspense, unable to take their eyes off the proceedings. The silence in the courtroom had grown thick with tension, as if the very air was holding its breath. Jasmine Crockett could feel it, the weight of every eye in the room, not only on her, but also the invisible pressure from forces beyond her control. It wasn't just a legal case anymore. It had become a battle against a system steeped in power, corruption, and manipulation. Jasmine was not just fighting Robert Mitchell. She was up against an entire structure that sought to bury the truth at all costs. As Jasmine continued presenting her solid evidence, the interruptions from Judge Thornton were relentless. But it was clear to her that his resistance was not the only obstacle she had to face. A quiet suspicion began to gnaw at her. The pressure wasn't just coming from Thornton. It was coming from another source, Mitchell's company. Jasmine keenly observed the subtle shifts in the room, the glances exchanged, the small, unconscious gestures of the jurors that made her feel increasingly uncomfortable. Something wasn't right. She noticed a subtle change in the attitude of the jurors. One male juror, sitting near the center, stood up and made a motion as though engaging in an offhand discussion with someone beside him. They didn't speak, but Jasmine could sense the discomfort emanating from them. She also noticed one of the jurors on her left who kept glancing toward one of Mitchell's attorneys, someone she recognized as having been in meetings before the trial with those connected to Mitchell. The connection was subtle, but it was there, and it set off a deep unease in her. Jasmine's suspicion grew as Thornton's irrelevant questions continued to increase. Despite Jasmine having presented all necessary evidence, Thornton's questions seemed to drift further away from the case at hand, focusing on minute details that seemed designed to distract and undermine the weight of the evidence she had so carefully built. But what truly alarmed Jasmine was the presence of the companies behind Mitchell. She knew they weren't just using financial influence. They were leveraging their power to manipulate the people in that very courtroom. Jasmine had heard rumors about Mitchell's connections with some members of the judicial system, and it seemed that those rumors were beginning to manifest right there in front of her eyes. Her suspicions became clearer when she realized an important detail. One of the jurors sitting near the door appeared unable to tear his gaze away from one of Mitchell's attorneys. This time, the look wasn't one of skepticism but of clear agreement, almost as if they were on the same side. While there was no concrete evidence to suggest that this juror was being manipulated, the silent exchange between them was undeniable. The subtle, unspoken communication made Jasmine uneasy, and she knew that something was amiss. A surge of doubt swept over Jasmine. She couldn't sit idly by in this situation. It seemed as if Mitchell and his team had planted influence in the very heart of this courtroom. The hidden forces at play were not just working from the shadows of the law. They were in the room, actively working to manipulate and undermine the truth she was fighting so hard to protect. These covert pressures were not just coming from Thornton. They were also coming from the people in the room, the ones she had trusted to help seek justice. And then, when Jasmine looked at Mitchell's lawyers again, she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. They exchanged looks that were far too confident, far too assured. It wasn't the confidence of a strong defense team. It was the confidence of those who knew they had already won, those who knew they had the protection of unseen forces. It was the type of arrogance that only comes when you're certain that no one will stand in your way. In that moment, Jasmine felt the full weight of a deeply unfair system pressing down on her. All of her efforts, all the evidence she had presented, seemed like mere grains of sand against the storm of power. But she couldn't step back. This wasn't just about one case. This was about fighting for the people who had no voice, for the justice that these forces were trying to smother. "Your Honor," Jasmine's voice rang out, but it was no longer soft and measured. Each word she spoke carried weight and conviction. "We cannot allow the powers outside of this courtroom to influence our decisions. I ask the court to carefully examine the evidence and the clear signs of external interference." Each word felt like a sharp arrow, piercing the suffocating atmosphere of the courtroom. Jasmine knew that once the influence of these hidden forces was exposed, everything would change. Thornton could strike his gavel, Mitchell's team could fight back, but Jasmine Crockett would not give up this fight. The courtroom once again descended into a tense silence, thick with anticipation. After Thornton's constant objections to every piece of evidence Jasmine presented, the air had become suffocating. With every gaze now fixed on her, Jasmine was fully absorbed in the mound of documents before her. Each page felt like a test she couldn't afford to fail. But in that moment, amidst the chaotic pile of papers, one small line of text caught her attention. Jasmine quietly flipped through the pages, her eyes carefully scanning every word. She had been meticulously reviewing every piece of evidence again, rechecking it all, hoping to uncover something that could break the case wide open. With every turn of the page, it felt as though she was peeling back layers of deceit, layers designed to obscure the truth. Then she found what she had been looking for. A contract for a $3 million transfer had been signed between Robert Mitchell and a company that she suspected to be a shell company, a company that didn't exist. But what truly stunned Jasmine wasn't the money. It was the signature on the contract. Her heart skipped a beat. Her eyes locked onto that signature. It was unmistakable. The signature on that contract was none other than Thornton's. Judge Edward Thornton, the very man sitting at the bench presiding over this case. The revelation hit her like a bolt of lightning. A monumental scandal not just about Mitchell anymore, but about the very justice system she was fighting to protect. This was undeniable proof that could shatter everything. All she had to do now was stand up and expose it to the light. But Jasmine didn't allow herself to be swept away by the wave of emotions. She knew this moment could change the entire course of the trial. She had to remain calm, steadfast, for what she had uncovered could trigger a scandal that could send shock waves through the judicial system. She looked over the contract again, and there were no signs of forgery. Thornton's signature was clearly authentic. Jasmine took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on her. It was as if the entire courtroom was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. But Jasmine wasn't rushing. She knew that once this truth was exposed, there would be no turning back. Thornton's career would be destroyed, and Mitchell's role in this scandal would be revealed for all to see. This was more than a legal battle. It was a fight to expose the forces that had been manipulating justice for years. Slowly, she placed the contract down on the table and glanced over at Thornton once again. She couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine as she looked at his cold, unwavering face. It felt as though time itself was suspended in that moment. Jasmine could sense that Thornton, despite his stone-cold exterior, was beginning to feel the pressure. He knew that the tide was shifting. Jasmine stood up from the prosecution table, the tension in her body palpable, like a blade poised to strike. She turned to face the entire courtroom, her eyes narrowing as they locked onto Thornton's. Then her voice rang out clearly, full of determination. "Your Honor, I have found irrefutable evidence. This is a contract for a $3 million transfer, and the signature on this contract is that of Judge Edward Thornton. This proves that you were involved in concealing the truth and collaborating with Robert Mitchell in embezzling public funds." The courtroom seemed to come alive with sudden energy, as if waking from a long, uneasy slumber. Every eye in the room turned to Thornton, and the tension in the air was thicker than ever. The jurors exchanged looks, some incredulous, others stunned by the revelation. Thornton shifted in his seat, his hands no longer confident but trembling slightly, a stark contrast to the unshakable figure he had been moments before. The shift in the courtroom was palpable. Jasmine could feel it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. All of Thornton's manipulation, all the denials from Mitchell's team, no longer held any weight. Jasmine had uncovered the truth, and it was a truth that would change the course of this battle. The courtroom had fallen into a heavy, almost suffocating silence. The tension in the air seemed to thicken with every passing second, as though the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Jasmine Crockett could feel the weight of every eye on her, but it wasn't just the gaze of those in the room that she was battling. It was the invisible pressure from forces beyond her reach, forces that had the power to turn this battle into an even more impossible fight. This was no longer just a legal case. It was a confrontation with a system that was relentlessly designed to suppress the truth. After uncovering Thornton's signature on the $3 million contract, Jasmine knew she had struck at the heart of a massive scandal. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that could bring everything to light. But when she asked for a recess to verify the documents and investigate the evidence of Thornton's involvement, things took an abrupt turn. Jasmine raised the contract in front of her, her voice unwavering as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, I request that we pause the proceedings to thoroughly verify the documents regarding Judge Thornton's signature and the money transfers to the shell company. This is crucial evidence, and we cannot proceed without an independent examination." She knew that if the trial were paused, she would have the opportunity to clarify all doubts and expose the truth. But Thornton's response was like a sharp slap to her hopes. "There is no need for a break, Miss Crockett." Thornton's voice was icy, cutting through the room like a blade. "The court does not need time off. I have heard enough." His cold words rang through the courtroom, smothering the tension with a sense of finality. Jasmine could feel the oppressive force of his authority. This wasn't just a simple decision. It was a deliberate attempt to stifle the truth before it could even be given a chance to unfold. Jasmine understood the reality now. Every path to the truth seemed locked. The questions, the documents, and even fairness itself couldn't get past the wall of power Thornton had built. This was not merely the manipulation of one judge. It was the manipulation of an entire system designed to bury the truth, to ensure that justice would never advance. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew more intense by the second. Jasmine felt as if she were being cornered, every word from Thornton pressing down on her like a heavy stone. She had to fight not just against Thornton, not just against Mitchell, but against a system that had protected injustice for far too long. But Jasmine was not going to back down. She knew this was the decisive moment, the turning point. Despite being pushed back, despite facing unimaginable pressure, she would stand firm. She couldn't allow the truth to be buried, not now. Your Honor, Jasmine continued, her voice steady, unwavering. I understand that the court wishes to continue, but I demand transparency and fairness. We cannot proceed under these circumstances if we do not properly verify these crucial documents. I ask the court to reconsider this decision. The tension in the room was palpable. Thornton could not take his eyes off Jasmine, but for the first time, there was a hint of unease in his gaze. He had chosen his path, but Jasmine could sense that deep down, he knew he was on the verge of a battle he could not easily win. Once again, Thornton slammed the gavel down with force, but this time the sound was less authoritative, less confident. The trial will continue, he said, his voice no longer sharp but tinged with uncertainty, as though seeking support from the power that stood behind him. We do not need any further checks. The trial will proceed with what has already been presented. Jasmine knew this was just the beginning. This fight was far from over. If she stopped now, it would all be meaningless. The truth, no matter how hard it was to push through, would find its way. She could not let manipulation and power crush justice. She could not step back, and she would not give up. The courtroom had descended into a state of palpable tension, almost as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. All eyes were fixed on Jasmine Crockett, and every second that passed seemed to bring her closer to a critical point where every word she uttered could either unlock the truth or deliver a fatal blow to her entire fight. But Jasmine knew one thing for certain. No matter how much manipulation she faced, no matter how cornered she was by the powerful forces at play, she could not stay silent. She picked up a new stack of documents, her eyes scanning each page methodically. The weight of her thoughts kept circling back to the intricate connection between Robert Mitchell and Judge Edward Thornton. While she didn't have direct evidence yet, her instincts told her that everything was slowly starting to align. The huge sums of money Mitchell had funneled into these shell companies, the shady transactions, everything seemed to be woven together into a more complex web of corruption, one that involved Thornton at its very core. This wasn't just a case of embezzlement anymore. It was potentially a vast network of corruption and abuse of power, with Thornton being the pivotal link. But as Jasmine stood up to present her findings, her voice remained strong, unyielding. She knew that despite everything, the weight of power in that room could still twist the narrative to their favor. Your Honor, she began, her eyes never leaving Thornton's. We don't only have documents showing the transfers from Mitchell to non-existent companies. We also have evidence of a deeply troubling and suspicious relationship between Judge Thornton and Robert Mitchell, a potential illegal alliance to conceal the truth. Jasmine slowly opened a new document, call logs and emails revealing exchanges between Mitchell and Thornton. These communications clearly demonstrated that the two had been in constant contact in the days leading up to the illicit transfers. Every detail, every line of text, seemed to paint a clear picture of collusion. But Jasmine couldn't find the words to express the intensity of what she was feeling. She knew she was risking everything, her career, her reputation, by pointing to forces so powerful, forces that no one dared to challenge. She continued, in these exchanges, it's evident that Thornton wasn't just a judge overseeing the case, but someone directly involved in protecting Mitchell's illicit dealings. These emails show that he was fully aware of the money transfers, and yet continued to wield his power to cover up the truth. The courtroom froze. The jurors exchanged looks, their eyes filled with doubt. But Thornton remained motionless. His face didn't change. Jasmine could see a flicker of contempt in his eyes, as if he knew she was betting everything on this evidence, as if he knew the storm that was brewing. Jasmine refused to be shaken. She pressed on, her voice harder, laced with both anger and determination. I demand that the court recognize these documents as legitimate evidence. These are not forgeries, and I have more than enough grounds to prove that Thornton has been complicit in covering up this corruption. Before Jasmine could continue, Thornton slammed the gavel down, his expression unreadable. Miss Crockett, I've heard enough. These documents cannot be accepted as evidence in this trial. There is nothing definitive in what you've presented. I see no connection between these individuals. Each word Thornton spoke felt like a knife slashing through the truth Jasmine had painstakingly woven together. He wasn't just denying the evidence. He was actively trying to redirect and obscure everything she had uncovered. Jasmine could feel the anger rising within her, but she knew she couldn't let her emotions take over. This was the moment she had to fight not only against Thornton but against a system that had protected him for so long. Thornton's response only deepened Jasmine's suspicions. This wasn't just the denial of one judge. It was the forceful attempt to push back justice, to suffocate the truth. Jasmine could feel the system itself protecting Thornton and Mitchell, and she realized that she was merely a small part of a much larger battle. The sense of a vast conspiracy loomed over everything. Jasmine couldn't shake the thought that every action Thornton had taken, every interruption, every attempt to dismiss the evidence, was designed with one goal: to keep the truth buried in the dark. But Jasmine couldn't give up. She couldn't stand by and watch as justice was crushed beneath the weight of manipulation. She knew that if she didn't stand up and break through these walls of power, everything would fade into oblivion. "Your Honor." Jasmine's voice no longer quivered with uncertainty, but was now filled with resolute determination. "The truth will not be suppressed forever. I will not be silent. And if the court refuses to acknowledge these crucial documents, I will continue to fight until the truth prevails." The words rang out, unwavering, as she held her ground. In that moment, Jasmine knew that this was just the beginning of a battle far greater than any she had imagined. She was ready to fight, no matter the cost. The courtroom had become unervingly silent, the tension so thick that it felt like the very air had been sucked out of the room. The only sounds were the scribbling of pens on paper and the soft tapping of Judge Thornton's gavel. Jasmine Crockett sat at the prosecution table, her mind running through the evidence she had presented so far. But it seemed to be insufficient in breaking the impasse. Thornton continued to interrupt every step she took, his every objection an effort to push justice back into the shadows of power. With each question, each attempt to silence her, Jasmine felt like she was fighting against an immovable machine of power. Just as Jasmine was beginning to lose hope in this battle, a sudden message flashed on her phone. It was from Jake, a seasoned investigative journalist who had been helping her gather crucial evidence. "Pay attention to Thornton's signature. That's the mark you can't erase." Jasmine's heart jolted to life. This was an unmistakable sign. If Jake had found something significant about Thornton's signature, she knew this was the key to unlocking the truth that those in power had been desperately trying to hide. With no time to waste, Jasmine quickly contacted Jake and made plans for a covert investigation. She could not sit idly by while justice was still being smothered. Driven by her newfound resolve, she began her search for more evidence. The following day, Jasmine received a call from Jake. His voice was filled with urgency. "Jasmine, I've got a recording that I think you'll need. It's going to change everything." A wave of anticipation washed over her as she heard those words. She quickly opened the audio file Jake had sent. The first words she heard were chilling, the cold, calculated voice of Thornton. "Don't let her find the contract. Everything must be kept hidden." Jasmine's mind reeled. She had thought she had uncovered everything, but this recording revealed an entirely new level of corruption. The tape not only confirmed Thornton's involvement in Mitchell's embezzlement scheme, but it also showed that he had been actively trying to block Jasmine from uncovering the truth. Her heart raced with a renewed sense of purpose. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. This recording could not be ignored, no matter the danger it might bring. Jasmine knew that presenting this evidence in court would escalate the tension, but this was a chance she could not afford to miss. She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. In her mind, the images of this struggle played out clearly. The recording would be her final weapon to break the cover-up and expose Thornton's manipulation. But could she defeat the power he held? As the next session of the trial began, Jasmine stood, her heart pounding in her chest, but her mind calm and focused as never before. She could not allow fear or pressure to make her retreat. This was the moment she had to fight with everything she had, for justice, for the truth. Thornton stared at Jasmine with cold, calculating eyes, as if already prepared to block whatever move she made. But Jasmine remained undeterred. She walked up to the prosecution table, her voice resolute as she demanded, "Your Honor, I request that the court allow the public release of a recording I've just received from an investigative reporter." This recording directly implicates Judge Edward Thornton in concealing the truth. I believe this will be the decisive evidence in this case." The courtroom fell into silence. Everyone present exchanged glances, the weight of the moment settling over them. You could almost feel the electricity in the air. Jasmine wasn't just confronting a corrupt judge. She was taking on an entire system of power. Thornton's face remained unchanged, but there was an unmistakable trace of anxiety in his eyes. "Miss Crockett," he growled, his voice sharp and forceful, "I will not allow anything to disrupt this trial. That recording has no legal value, and I ask that you cease this immediately." His words were a command, but Jasmine did not back down. "That recording is clear proof of corruption and the suppression of evidence by Thornton. If the court refuses to acknowledge it, I will not stop," Jasmine retorted, her voice firm, her resolve unshaken. And then, without waiting for further objections, she demanded that the recording be played aloud in the courtroom. The atmosphere became even heavier as all eyes were glued to the audio equipment. Jasmine's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the power now in her grasp. This was the turning point. Everything would change from this moment on. As the recording played, Thornton's voice rang out, clear and undeniable. "Don't let her find the contract." The words were a thunderclap that reverberated through the room. The entire courtroom froze, the silence thick with shock and disbelief. The jurors sat still, their faces etched with astonishment, their eyes wide in disbelief. The recording not only confirmed Thornton's involvement in the corruption, but also exposed the conspiracy behind the cover-up. The room was stunned into silence. No one could have predicted that the very man presiding over the trial would be the one caught red-handed. The silence lingered, heavy and suffocating. In that moment, it was clear to everyone in the room that there was no longer any defense for Thornton's actions. Jasmine Crockett had brought forth irrefutable evidence. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The courtroom was suffused with an unnerving silence after the recording had been played. The atmosphere seemed to freeze as every person in the room could no longer tear their gaze away from Thornton. His own words from the tape, the threats and the instructions that confirmed his involvement in the corruption scandal, pierced through the impenetrable veil of power he had built over the years. The jurors, who had sat in silence up until this moment, began exchanging glances. The sense of disbelief swept through them, and one by one, they turned to each other, blinking slowly, beginning to grasp the gravity of the evidence Jasmine had presented. Thornton sat motionless, his face drained of color, his eyes now betraying a deep sense of confusion. Once a towering figure of judicial power, he now appeared as nothing more than a man exposed, stripped of his carefully cultivated mask. The once invincible judge was now the subject of his own unraveling. Mitchell, who had once been so confident, now found himself panicking. The calm demeanor of the wealthy businessman had dissolved, replaced with a look of fear. His hands trembled slightly, as though realizing the empire he had built was on the verge of collapse. Jasmine, though she could feel the tension rising inside her, maintained her composure. She knew this moment would change everything. This wasn't just about winning or losing the case. It was about shattering the wall that had been erected to protect the corrupt. She turned back to face Thornton, her voice steady but full of respect. "Your Honor, I request an independent investigation to thoroughly examine all the evidence we have gathered. We cannot allow such a massive scandal to be covered up. The truth must be exposed." The courtroom seemed to awaken from its long slumber. People began to realize that Jasmine was not someone to be easily silenced. She was fighting not only for justice, but for those who had no voice in the system. Thornton, after what felt like an eternity, tried to hold on to his crumbling image. He attempted to push back, his voice rising in a desperate growl that no one could miss, a clear sign of his hopelessness. "This is slander. It's all fabricated," Thornton shouted, but his voice was growing weaker. The authority of a once powerful judge slipping away with each passing word. But Jasmine was unfazed. She knew the truth was no longer something that could be hidden. Each word Thornton spoke, each of his desperate defenses, only revealed his increasing impotence. Jasmine stood firm, her gaze fixed on his face. "Your Honor, we cannot ignore this evidence," Jasmine said, her voice unwavering and strong. "We cannot allow justice to be obscured by power and corruption." I demand this investigation be conducted immediately. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak. The jurors, who had once hesitated, now began to see through the dark veil the powerful had tried to maintain. Thornton, unable to retain the dignity of his former judicial status, attempted to argue, but his words grew weaker and weaker. Each sentence he spoke made the truth more glaring. It was too late for denial. The secrets he had spent years guarding were now being dragged into the light. Finally, Thornton slumped into his chair, unable to hide the fear in his eyes. His career, the decisions he had made over the years, now hung by a fragile thread. Everything he had done, every manipulation of power, now lay in tatters, irreparable. Mitchell, once confident that his wealth and power would shield him, now no longer had the strength to sit upright. He lowered his head, sweat soaking his face. He realized that all his plans were crumbling. Jasmine had uncovered the truth, and now she was fighting to bring it into the open. The courtroom was drowned in silence, but Jasmine knew this was only the beginning. The battle was far from over. These powerful forces would not give up easily, but Jasmine Crockett was ready to face them all. The courtroom was stunned into silence as the heavy doors suddenly swung open. A burst of light from the hallway flooded in, creating an atmosphere as though a storm was about to hit. Everyone in the room turned their heads, and in that fleeting moment, they could hardly believe their eyes. Pam Bondi, the U.S. Attorney General, entered with an air of confidence and authority. No formal introduction or announcement was needed. Her presence was like a lightning strike, causing an immediate shift in the energy of the room. Dressed in a sharp black suit, with her blonde hair neatly cut and her piercing eyes sharp as blades, she exuded power. Each step she took was deliberate and filled with authority. All eyes were on her. It was impossible not to notice that she was carrying a message of monumental importance. The whispers from the audience and the jurors began to die down, their attention fully on her. Jasmine stood up from the prosecutor's table, her eyes lighting up as she recognized the arrival of someone she had been waiting for. This was the moment, a figure powerful enough to challenge those who upheld the corruption, to shatter the cover-up that had plagued the courtroom. Pam Bondi walked confidently toward the prosecutor's table where Jasmine stood, and, without wasting any time, she delivered her statement decisively. Judge Edward Thornton, I, Pamela Bondi, U.S. Attorney General, under the authority of the Department of Justice, hereby declare that you are under immediate arrest for obstruction of justice, corruption, and abuse of power. Her words thundered through the room like a clap of thunder, igniting an explosion of shock. Those present were left speechless, their eyes wide with disbelief. The room fell into absolute silence. Time seemed to freeze, and everyone's gaze shifted toward Thornton, the judge who had once held all the power in the courtroom. Thornton, once the epitome of composure and self-importance, could no longer maintain his stoic facade. His confidence evaporated, replaced by palpable confusion and panic. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, his hands trembling slightly. The judge who once held the highest authority in the room now found himself on the precipice of disgrace. Mitchell, who had once been so certain of his invulnerability, now found himself rattled. His usual calm composure shattered, his face paling as he began to realize that everything he had built was beginning to crumble. Jasmine, despite the tension bubbling inside her, maintained her poise. She knew that this moment would alter the course of everything. This wasn't just about winning or losing the trial. It was about tearing down the wall of corruption that had shielded the guilty for so long. She turned to face Thornton once more, her voice resolute yet respectful. Your Honor, I propose that an independent investigation be conducted to thoroughly examine all the evidence we have. We cannot allow a scandal of this magnitude to be covered up. The truth must come to light. The room seemed awake from its long slumber. The people present suddenly realized that Jasmine was not someone to be easily silenced. She was fighting not only for justice, but for those who had been silenced by the system. Thornton, after what felt like an eternity, tried to hold on to his crumbling image. He desperately fought back, his voice rising in a futile roar that no one could ignore, a clear indication of his utter hopelessness. This is slander. It's all fabricated, Thornton shouted, but his voice grew weaker and weaker, no longer possessing the commanding force of a powerful judge. But Jasmine was unwavering. She knew that the truth had already slipped from the cracks, and no amount of denial could stop it. Each word Thornton spoke, each justification he offered, only exposed his powerlessness. Jasmine stood firm, her gaze never leaving his face. "Your Honor, we cannot disregard this evidence," Jasmine said, her voice unwavering and strong. "We cannot allow justice to be clouded by power and corruption. I demand this investigation be carried out immediately." The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. The jurors, who had once hesitated, now began to see through the dark veil the powerful had tried to keep intact. Thornton, now stripped of the imposing dignity he once carried, attempted to argue, but his words grew feeble. Each sentence he uttered made the truth clearer. It was too late for denial. The secrets he had spent years shielding were now being dragged into the light. Finally, Thornton slumped into his chair, unable to mask the fear in his eyes. His career, the decisions he had made over the years, were now hanging by a thin thread. Everything he had done, every manipulation of power, now lay in ruins, irreparable. Mitchell, once so confident that his wealth and influence would protect him, now lacked the strength to sit upright. He lowered his head, sweat soaking his face. He realized that all his schemes had collapsed. Jasmine had uncovered the truth, and now she was fighting to expose it to the world. The courtroom remained in silence, but Jasmine knew this was only the beginning. The battle was far from over. These powerful forces would not give up easily, but Jasmine Crockett was ready to face them all. The day after the trial, the eerie silence that once dominated the courtroom was no longer present. It took some time for the initial shock to fade, but now everyone in the room could feel the shift. Thornton, who had once held the highest power in the courtroom, was now in custody. However, Jasmine Crockett knew that the battle was far from over. As Thornton was escorted out of the room, Jasmine stood there, not because of the temporary victory, but because she understood that this was only the beginning. She knew that corrupt individuals did not easily relinquish their power, especially in a system like this where those at the top always try to protect each other. Jasmine had to continue, even if it meant facing fierce opposition from those who had been hiding dark secrets for years. When she stepped out of the courtroom, everyone turned to look at her. Many people showed admiration for her, but deep down, Jasmine didn't feel the glory of victory. She felt like a warrior, knowing the journey was far from over. She couldn't allow herself to rest, for she knew there was still much to uncover. "This is just the first step," Jasmine reminded herself as she looked out of the window where the sun had set, giving way to the darkness of the night. But she knew that sometimes it takes the dark to see the stars, and today those stars were the truth. As soon as Thornton was arrested, Jasmine realized that the forces behind these corrupt actions would not sit idly by. Mitchell, although a significant step forward in the investigation, was not the only one Jasmine had to face. She knew that the people behind him were still lurking in the shadows, controlling everything from afar. Jasmine had to keep fighting to bring them all into the light. She couldn't stop now. With her unwavering spirit, Jasmine always knew she would face greater challenges, but that only made her stronger, more determined. She stood up from her desk, her gaze filled with resolve. The justice system had been wounded, and Jasmine would be the one to continue exposing the truth, not only for the people who had been overlooked, but for justice itself. Jasmine felt true courage now. She could clearly see where she stood, not on the peak of victory, but on the summit of a difficult and long road. But she wouldn't back down, and she wouldn't let anyone destroy what she had built, no matter how dangerous the forces lurking in the shadows. In her meeting with Pam Bondi shortly after, Jasmine did not hide her concerns. "We've won a battle, but this war isn't just about Mitchell and Thornton. There are many more behind them. We need to keep digging deeper," Jasmine said, stressing the urgency. Pam Bondi, the U.S. Attorney General, looked at her with pride. "Jasmine, what we did today was important, but I understand your concern. We'll continue and uncover everything, step by step. No one can hide from justice forever." Jasmine felt a surge of new energy. Though this battle would not be easy, she was no longer alone. She had connected with others who shared her ideals and determination. Together, they would expose every conspiracy, every cover-up in the system. As Jasmine walked out of Pam Bondi's office, she felt a stronger connection than ever before. She was no longer just a young attorney. She was an integral part of the fight for truth and justice. The challenges ahead would be unavoidable, but Jasmine was ready to face them. She knew that no matter how difficult the path, in the end, justice would prevail.